Welcome to the first lecture of the 2020-2021 Read the Revolution Speaker Series. I'm Scott Stevenson, I'm President and CEO of the Museum of the American Revolution here at 3rd and Chestnut Streets in Philadelphia, just down the street from Independence Hall. I am so excited. This is our first virtual Read the Revolution lecture for the year, and we have over 130 people from 23 states who are registered tonight. People from Hawaii, from South Dakota, from Colorado, from California, from Kentucky, from Maine, and all points in between. So it is so wonderful to have all of you here this evening with us. Now, we have a couple of special guests with us tonight that I want to give a special shout out to. Evan Romano and Ansh Sharma are high school seniors who are contemplating becoming students cadets at the United States Military Academy, are aspiring officers in our armed forces. And so I'd like to salute both of you this evening and thank you for considering military service in this nation. And maybe you'll get a few extra credit points listening to Lieutenant Colonel Scully's talk this evening. Now, for those of you who are joining us for the first time tonight, who maybe this is your first introduction to the Museum of the American Revolution, I'd like you to, not now, but when we're done, go to the website, amrevmuseum.org. Spend a little time taking a look at our brand new revamped website. Actually, all of you should take a look at this if you haven't been on recently. This is hot off the press, just launched about a week ago. You're going to be really excited to see all of the new features, our virtual museum tour, which allows you to explore all the galleries from the comfort of your home. Lots of great enhanced digital content. And if you like what you see and you're not already a member, click on that Join and Support tab and consider becoming a member. You'll join over 5,000 people from every state in this nation and armed forces serving abroad, and even some international members who not only like coming to the museum or participating in our online programs, but really support the mission of the museum, which is to uncover and share surprising stories about the diverse people, about the complex events that sparked America's ongoing, and I stress ongoing, experiment in liberty, equality, and self-government. You'll feel good about it. Consider making a gift membership perhaps in this coming holiday season. So thank you for those of you who are out there supporting us already. Now, among those supporters, I have to give a big shout out to our sponsors for not just this evening's program, but the whole suite of Read the Revolution programs, the Haverford Trust Company. Now, Haverford Trust has been a good friend of the museum since before we opened, and they have sponsored a number of our initiatives and programs here, but really love our Read the Revolution series. Now, as I mentioned, this is not just the lecture series that you're participating in tonight, although that alone is one of our great marquee programs here at the museum. All of you who've registered for tonight's program would have received an email yesterday that's part of our Read the Revolution digital edition. This is a bi-weekly email that you receive. It goes out to more than 50,000 subscribers, and those are curated excerpts of books about the American Revolution that are a great quick read that kind of connects you with new history, historiography, stories of the American Revolution. And you can sign up for Read the Revolution. There's no cost associated with that on the website. And finally, for those of you who are members of our Revolution Society and George Washington Council, we have added a third program this year, again, all sponsored by Haverford Trust. This is called Founding Footnotes. And it's our inaugural one's just coming up here next week. And it's actually a kind of salon style, small group discussion of original historic documents that we've mined from the footnotes of books like Contest for Liberty, Lieutenant Colonel Shonnegan Scully's book that you'll be hearing about just a little bit later. And so before I introduce Lieutenant Colonel Scully, I'd like to just turn the screen over for just a moment to our good friend Tim Gillespie, who's Vice President and Director of Client Management at Haverford Trust. Tim and Susan Gillespie, good friends of ours. They, I think, get the gold star for the best in-person attendance at all of our programs here at the museum, and they've been great friends of the museum, as Haverford Trust has been for the last 3 years. And so love to hear from Tim now.
Thank you, Scott, and good evening, everyone. I am pleased to be here, and I'm also proud to represent Haverford Trust Company and my associates, David Papard, Rob Stiles, and Diane DePrinzio. For more than 41 years, Haverford Trust has been an investment management and trust company dedicated to serving the financial needs of individuals, families, and institutions. We're based in Radnor, Pennsylvania, and with about $10 billion in assets under management, we're a local firm, and we feel it is incumbent upon us to give back to the community that we love. We know this has been a particularly challenging year for so many of you, both personally and professionally. And we've had to learn different ways to communicate than our norm. But I'm proud to say that through the efforts of our dedicated staff and our incredible investment research and marketing teams, we've actually enhanced our ability to engage with our clients over the course of this year. Still, we long to return to the days when events like this can be conducted both in person as well as virtually, and those days will come. Haverford Trust is very excited to continue our sponsorship of the museum's wonderful Read the Revolution program. We enjoy a close working relationship with Scott and his amazing team, and this relationship is incredibly important to Haverford as we firmly believe in the mission of the museum. As Scott said, this is also personal for me, as my wife Susan and I have been involved with the museum basically since the inception of the museum and are members of the museum's Revolution Society. We have attended so many events at the museum, we consider it our home away from home. I encourage any of you who have yet to attend the museum to please make a visit because you'll be in for a rare treat. In closing, I want to thank Scott, Claudia, Adam, and all of our friends at the museum for allowing Haverford Trust the opportunity to sponsor this fantastic program. And I wish you and your families a happy and, most importantly, a safe Thanksgiving holiday. Scott, I'll turn it back to you, and I look forward to hearing from my fellow Irishmen.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Tim. There's a lot of Irishmen in this crowd here this evening, and Irish women. Well, finally, I'm just so excited and proud to introduce someone who's not just a great historian, a great military commander, but also a good friend of the museum, and that's Lieutenant Colonel Shawnigan P. Scully. Lieutenant Scully, Sean, as we know him, is joining us live tonight from the United States Military Academy at West Point. He received his PhD from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and he serves as an associate professor of history at West Point. One of the many things I respect so much about Sean is he started his military career as a PFC and has worked his way up through the ranks and has an incredible perspective, and he'll share a little bit of his personal experience and how that sort of launched his interest in this question of military discipline and the American style of military discipline that rose out of the experience of the Continental Army. Now, Lieutenant Colonel Scully is certainly no stranger to the museum. He's a regular presence down here up until the present unpleasantness with coronavirus. We were accustomed to regular visits from Sean and his cadets in the history department coming down to visit the museum to kind of use it as a live learning laboratory. They came down when in January of 2018, we unveiled our exhibition Among His Troops, Washington's War Tent in a newly discovered watercolor. And actually it was wonderful to be able to show those cadets an original watercolor, a panoramic painting of West Point, painted in the summer of 1782 by Pierre Charles L'Enfant. He also unveiled a special app, a kind of virtual view of West Point in the era of the Revolutionary War here at the museum on our 1-year anniversary. So Sean's talk this evening is based on his book, and I'm just going to show it to you here, Contest for Liberty, Military Leadership in the Continental Army. You'll recognize the image of the painting. For those of you who have visited the museum, you've seen the large version of Couder's painting of Washington and Rochambeau and the French officers at Yorktown in 1781. Now, we encourage you throughout the evening, if you have questions, to use the chat function and send those along, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can at the end of the evening. And also, there's a special interactive feature this evening that Lieutenant Colonel Scully is going to tee you up for. You're going to want to use this. You'll actually be doing some voting along the way and providing some interaction. So without further ado, please join me in a warm welcome for Lieutenant Colonel Shawnigan P. Scully. Take it away.
Okay, sorry about that. We've tested this a couple of times and I'm still going to make some mistakes, so I apologize for that. Everybody, good evening, and thank you to the Museum of the American Revolution, to Scott, to Hannah, to everyone who works at the museum for inviting me to be the first one to do this seminar or webinar with everybody this year. So I want to start by talking about how I got to this topic on military leadership in the American Revolution. And it actually starts when I was a private first class back in 1997. I entered the Army in 1995. And in 1997, I was in Albania. And my job was to train soldiers from former Warsaw Pact countries who were interested in joining NATO. And one of the things that I noticed was that their officers acted very differently from ours. And the story that I like to tell that seems to epitomize this difference is that in the American Army, the officers eat last. The soldiers eat first, and we eat by by order of the most junior officer to the most senior, the most junior soldier to the most senior officer. And what I noticed when I was in those mountains in Albania was that the officers from these other countries acted completely differently. They ate first. They believed that they, by virtue of their rank, by virtue of their status, that they should eat first. And their soldiers seemed to agree with this. And at the time, I just thought that made them bad leaders. I didn't think anything else about it. I was very convinced that the American way of doing things was the way to do things. But it always stuck with me. I always thought about it. And then I was doing my graduate work at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And I started studying military leadership in the 7 Years' War in New England. And I realized that the British Army seemed to think that the New England officers were terrible officers. And I was trying to figure out why that was the case when, in fact, some of those New England regiments seemed to do pretty well, particularly when they were on their own. And then I went to Mosul, Iraq in 2009 as a military advisor when I was a major. As a military advisor and a supervisor of Iraqi soldiers, Iraqi police, and Kurdish Peshmerga. And what I found out was that I couldn't lead those soldiers in the same way that I led American soldiers. That if I allowed them to eat before me, or if I opened the door for them and allowed them to walk into the building before me, they didn't view that as a sign of respect. They viewed it as a weakness, as if I wasn't willing to take my rightful place as the leader of the group. And this really began my thoughts about leadership and about what is leadership. It's a term that a lot of people don't necessarily want to define, though the United States Army does define it. It defines it as providing purpose, direction, and motivation. But those terms seem to me to be American terms. They didn't seem to fit the other countries that I had seen. At the same time, I was moving into the study of the American Revolution, and I did want to study the Continental Army. And so I began to look at leadership in the Continental Army and try to understand that. And to start, I decided that I needed to figure out a way to define leadership that would allow me to avoid any cultural traps, if you would. As historians, we don't want to bring our own present into the past and try to judge the past that way. And so what I decided was that leadership is a cultural negotiation of authority, right? That negotiation is dependent upon the culture within which it's being had. And this negotiation is between the leaders and the led to determine how both decisions and their method of execution are reached. Now, in other studies of the Continental Army and of leadership in the Continental Army, leadership is usually understood in two other ways. And so to get started with that discussion, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And now you should see me much smaller, which is, I think, appropriate. And you should see the painting that we all know here up on the screen. Now, leadership is usually understood in one of two ways by historians. First, they will focus on strategic and tactical decisions. And they'll have arguments about whether or not Washington was a good leader in his strategy of avoiding a major defeat, or whether the British should have won the war or could have won the war. Or they'll look at tactical decisions. For example, at Germantown, should Washington have made the decision to split his forces into 4 columns, given the lack of training and the conditions at the time? The other focus would be on honor. There's quite a few works that look at honor. And they usually focus on Washington attempting to create a gentleman officer corps. And the tendency there for the soldiery, or for the look at soldiers over the course of the war, is that they become men of lower social status. And that increased durations of enlistment and harsher punishments led to the Continental Army looking more like the British. The problems, from my perspective, on both of these approaches is that the first approach gives us no sense that soldiers played much of a part in the outcome of the war. And the second approach denies us a sense that there was much of a relationship between officers and soldiers. Instead, we get a sense that each group developed identities separate from one another and didn't seem to really engage with one another in any real way. What my investigation determined instead was that there was a rich military tradition in the colonies prior to the war, and that greatly influenced the development of the Continental Army during the Revolution. These traditions pitted Washington's expectations against the traditions of New England, and we'll get into that in more detail here in just a minute. And given the fluidity of its development during a time of war, leadership in the Army was largely a factor of negotiations between officers and soldiers that created something new, something different. And this was because the soldiers in the Continental Army had more agency than we might expect. And this forced officers to understand something that we might actually assume today. And that is that if you want to lead soldiers here, you must first convince them to follow here. Okay? So tonight, what I'm going to do is lead you through an investigation of how leadership worked in 4 main topics. We're going to talk about recruiting, and we're going to talk about recruiting because that'll help us understand where did these soldiers and officers come from and how did their traditions influence the way they viewed leadership. Then we're going to talk about discipline. And by discipline, I mean the enforcement of military laws. In other words, the use of coercion in many ways to get soldiers to do what they were supposed to do or to punish them for failing to do so. The third topic will be on training. And the way I view training is the attempt to get the soldiers to commit themselves to the processes of the Army, to the tactical necessities of war, and to the ideology of the revolution. And then fourth, we're going to talk a little bit about how all of this came together in a very tense period of time towards the end of the war. But to get started, I'd like for us to play a little bit of a game, all right? And so what you're going to see here now on your screen is www.menti.com. And if you'll put that into your smartphone, into your tablet, some other device that you probably have next to you besides your computer. If you go to that website and you put the code in there that you see at the top, 5991069, it will bring you to this screen here on your phone. And I would ask that you take a moment and answer this question. What is the most important characteristic of a good leader? And I'll give you a minute or two to answer, and we'll see what happens. All right, now as we see the answers coming in here, the way this word cloud works, for those of you who haven't seen one of these before, is that the larger the word, the more frequently that word has been used by the people that are participating. I don't want to influence anybody's decisions here, so I'm just going to give it a little bit more time. Okay. So I'm sure more answers will be coming in as we move forward, but let's take a look at some of the words that are the largest here. Right now, notice that empathy is central. So this would mean that this is probably the trait that has is the most popular among the people with us tonight. And it's interesting that we would pick empathy, right? And the reason that I think that that's interesting is because for a good leader to be a good leader, if we believe that the most important characteristic is empathy, then what we're saying is that the most important thing that a leader needs to do is think about the people that he or she leads. And that fits very well with our culture. That makes sense in a democracy, in a republic where the power comes from below, from the people, and is granted to those in charge, right? Because we then expect that those people will then show their empathy for us, and that will make us want to follow them. But what if we came from a society that had very different values? What if we came, say, from 18th century England, when a class system was very much in effect, when people weren't known as citizens, but instead they were known as subjects, subjects of the king? Now, admittedly, by the 18th century, we have a lot of Whig philosophers who are saying no, power is coming up from the people. But if we could put ourselves in a position where we think about what if we thought power came from the top down, would empathy be something that we would expect? Would we expect necessarily somebody in a different class to lead by example, as is one of the other more common words here? And so I want you to think about these words, remember these, and see if perhaps what we don't start to see in the Continental Army in the 18th century during the American Revolution, if we don't start to see that in fact these same characteristics are the characteristics that they thought were important for them to be good leaders during the war. So I'll go to the next slide. Okay. Now I mentioned that there was a rich colonial tradition of military service that influenced the development of the Continental Army. And the strongest of those military traditions came from New England. And in particular, it came from the colony of Massachusetts. In each of the colonial wars fought in the 18th century, Massachusetts raised a provincial army comprised of voluntarily enlisted soldiers who enlisted for a single campaign season. And the officers were selected based on their ability to enlist those men. So what that meant was those would-be officers had to show either in their towns or in their counties that they were good leaders or leaders that could be trusted. And if so, those men would be willing to enlist with them, and that would determine their rank. If they didn't have that trust, they couldn't enlist those men, they wouldn't be given that rank. And military punishments in Massachusetts and throughout colonial New England were relatively light for the day. In fact, they were amazingly light for the day. Most infractions of military law could only be punished by a maximum of 39 lashes of the whip. Now, that sounds terrible to us today, but in fact, that's a biblical limitation that these Congregationalist New Englanders decided upon, because in the Bible it says that only a beast could be whipped 40 times. So 39 was the maximum. You're going to see that in comparison to the British Army, that's quite a low number. And there were very few crimes that were death penalties, capital crimes. And even if you were convicted of that, the governor of Massachusetts had to approve your death sentence. And the governor of Massachusetts was elected by the colony, not appointed by the crown. As an example of this, right, we see here a picture of the Battle of Lake George. It was fought in 1755. And in this battle, Colonel Ephraim Williams is killed in an ambush. He's the commander of a regiment out of Hampshire County, Massachusetts, the county seat being Northampton. After the battle, because Ephraim Williams was killed, the general in charge, who was from New York, needed to determine who would be the next commander of the regiment. And instead of picking Seth Pomeroy, who was the lieutenant colonel of that regiment, he picked Timothy Ruggles, who was the most senior of the Massachusetts officers at that location on Lake George. And as soon as he did so, the soldiers of the regiment told him, "That's fine, you violated our enlistments, we're going home." And General Winslow said, what are you talking about? They said, "We didn't enlist under Colonel Ruggles, we enlisted under Colonel Pomeroy, and if we don't get Colonel Pomeroy in command, we're going home." And this set up a flurry of communications from Northampton, and in fact, Seth Pomeroy was appointed the colonel. So the soldiers had a very clear agency to determine who was going to be their leader. Now, further south, in the colony of Virginia during the 7 Years' War, you have a very different development. Military tradition in the South was much less robust, and militias were usually focused on domestic policing. In particular, they were worried about slave revolts. During the 7 Years' War, Virginia had to create a new provincial system, and they did so based on the British model, which made sense because their society was much more class-based. There was a planter class that had most of the land and most of the wealth. There was a smaller middle class that were free yeoman farmers who wished to enter into the planter class. And then you had a base of poor whites who did not own any property, who were there and often seen as a problem in the colony. And so the model that Virginia came up with was gentlemen officers and lower class men who were forced into service. The military laws that Virginia selected looked just like the British Articles of War. They could give lash counts as high as 500 per infraction. And after a rough start for the first 2 years of that war, the Virginia regiment actually started to do well when the British government agreed to reimburse the Virginia House of Burgesses for the soldiers that they were paying for. And so they went from trying to draft poor landless men into paying for these men, but they remained very much a class-based organization with very harsh punishments. Now, in this painting here, you see Washington at the Battle of Monongahela. Now, Washington is actually the officer in the blue and red at the cannon pointing his sword. Washington became very famous in this battle because while the British General Edward Braddock dies here, Washington is credited with saving what's left of the British and American forces there and getting them back into Virginia safely from the forks of the Ohio near present-day Pittsburgh. What Washington learned from his time during the 7 Years' War was that the British model was the right model, that the British model was a successful way to command armies and discipline soldiers. Now, fast forward to 1775. After April of 1775, Boston is surrounded by a New England army. All of the soldiers that surround Boston during this period of time come from Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Rhode Island. It's not until later in the year that soldiers show up from Pennsylvania and a few from Virginia. And during this period of time, they seem to be doing all right. They kept the British bottled up in Boston, though this painting here, obviously famous painting, shows the tragedy of the death of Joseph Warren at the battle. And while the British claimed victory at the Battle of Bunker Hill in June of 1775, Sir Henry Clinton was very famous for saying that if the British had one more victory like this, they would surely lose the war. It was so costly to the British Army. Now, when I ask you a question, and let's see who knows the answer here. Who commanded the Continental Army at the Battle of Bunker Hill? Okay, it looks like Israel Putnam and William Prescott are winning. Wait until we get to about 50 and then I'll start up again. Okay. So it looks like the majority of us say Israel Putnam, and then it's William Prescott, and then Artemus Ward and George Washington. Well, it's kind of a trick question, but Israel Putnam is the wrong answer. He was there, and he was back on Bunker Hill, guiding the soldiers towards the front as best he could, and trying to get as many reinforcements for William Prescott as he could. But actually, at the battle, William Prescott is in charge of the command in the redoubt. But in fact, both Artemus Ward and George Washington overall commanded the army. Artemus Ward commanded the army in reality on the ground, but just 3 days earlier, the Continental Congress had actually declared the United Armies of the Colonies as the Continental Army and placed George Washington in charge. But why was Artemus Ward in charge before Washington arrived? He was in charge because he was the senior officer from Massachusetts, and Massachusetts was seen as the most important of the colonies represented in the forces surrounding Boston for several different reasons, one of which I've already talked about, which is their strong military tradition from the past. Now, during this period of time, Artemus Ward is doing everything he can to try to create a unified army, but the reality is that each regiment that was there was a regiment raised by a colonel at the behest of his colony. The men had enlisted to serve under that colonel and under his lieutenant colonel and under his company commanders and his lieutenants and even his non-commissioned officers. And these officers and soldiers, they're very closely linked to one another. They're from the same towns, they're from the same counties. And the officers are serving because the soldiers have agreed that they should be in charge. And when Washington shows up on July 2nd of 1775, he sees something that he can't believe. He's very unhappy. The soldiers have too much power to decide the terms of their service. The officers had to agree to those terms because all of the soldiers had to be reenlisted by December, at the end of December in 1776. So the soldiers have all the power. Washington wants to take much of that power away. And he has a plan, he has a program for doing this. He wants to get enlistments for the duration so that when soldiers enlist, they can't use their reenlistment as a way to negotiate any more autonomy within the Army. He wants to select the officers himself based on merit and honor. This way he can get the men that he believes and should be leading, and he can take that decision away from the soldiers. He wants to increase punishment to mirror the British. This way, if he's got a bunch of undisciplined soldiers, he can punish them and coerce them into doing what it is that he knows they need to do to win. And he wants to integrate the regiments so that we have New Hampshire soldiers serving with Virginia soldiers, serving with South Carolina soldiers, both so that he can unite everybody as Americans, but also so that he can separate the officers and the men one from the other. Right? But when he holds a council of war in October of 1775, and following a congressional visit that same month, he's forced to reenlist his entire army under New England terms. So soldiers refuse to enlist for longer than a year or under officers they do not choose. And his articles of war are going to be the Massachusetts articles, with few capital crimes and that famously low lash limit of 39. Additionally, he's not going to be able to pay them as little as he'd like. New York was paying their soldiers $5 a month, but Massachusetts was paying $6.33, and the entire army is now going to get paid for the private soldiers $6.33. And this is the army that Washington goes to war with in 1776. This is the army that he marches to New York with in the spring of 76. And though the regiments have the nomenclature of continental regiments, they are in fact state regiments. All of them pretty much look exactly like they looked in December of 1775. But with major defeats in New York and New Jersey in that year, along with other significant disciplinary problems, which we can talk about in the Q&A if you wish, Washington is able to convince Congress to give him more authority in shaping the leadership in the Continental Army that's going to be formed in 1777. Enlistments for 1777 are now going to be for 3 years or for the duration of the war. And the Articles of War, the military law of the Continental Army, is going to be rewritten to mirror the British with more capital crimes, and lash limits will be raised to 100. Now that's not as bad as the British, but it's still going to be significantly higher. What he's not going to be able to do, he's not going to get to choose his officers. Congress will retain that power. And the regiments are going to remain aligned by their states. And so this is when we get the formation of state lines. And you may have heard of these, the Massachusetts state line, the Pennsylvania state line. Right? So what does the composition of the Army look like under this new rule that you have to enlist for 3 years of the duration of the war? You know, given what we've learned, which state, on average, do you think supplied the most soldiers in the Continental Army? All right, it seems to be a close run between Massachusetts and Pennsylvania. That would actually make sense, right? Okay, then let me show you what we look like by 1780. Okay, so for the vast majority of the war, if not for the entirety of the war, it is Massachusetts by far that is the state that provides the most soldiers throughout the war. You can see in 1778, 1779, 1780. Not only is Massachusetts the largest provider of soldiers in the war, but between Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New England, fully 2/3 of the Continental Army is from New England. Now, why does this matter? While the second establishment of the Continental Army will be overly represent all of the new states, the majority come from New England. And these soldiers, particularly in the Massachusetts line, will continue to retain much of their ability to negotiate who will lead them and how, as they are all voluntarily enlisted into their regiments. There is no draft in Massachusetts, and they're going to be able to voluntarily enlist in the regiments of their choosing. Now, Connecticut will do something a little different. They're not going to draft their soldiers. They're going to do something called classing, which is a method that places more social pressure on the young men of towns to enlist rather than have their older brothers, fathers, or even grandfathers have to enlist when their quotas are called. But they usually get a pretty sizable financial inducement to make that decision. Now in Virginia, there will be a draft. They will be forced to draft men, and those men will oftentimes resist. And usually that meant that most of them were placed into service for as little as 8 months. Now, what does this mean for leadership? So during this period of time of 77, 78, 79, 80, officers who remain in service often climb the ranks by gaining experience in leading. But they do not necessarily gain any real rank in society, right? All of their gains are within the Continental Army, and their positions increasingly become ones of merit, divorced from enlistment, because they're not going back home and enlisting men. Soldiers, especially a strong corps who enlisted for 3 years or the duration, lose the ability to influence leadership through enlistments, but they become attached to their officers who lead them well while becoming increasingly influenced by the ideology of the revolution. And Washington famously is constantly invoking the ideology of the revolution to get his soldiers to continue to fight despite the odds. So we've seen what recruiting has done, right? It's created the majority New England Army, though it's influenced by participation from Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and other areas. And we've seen that the officers and the men are having some similar experiences, but then also some very different experiences. So how were these soldiers led? Well, one way that they could be led is through the use of disciplinary action, right? Through coercion. So let's take a look at how discipline played out in the Continental Army. Now, as I've said before, in the first 18 months, authority to use coercion to enforce discipline is incredibly limited. Right? Besides these small lash limits, most of the crimes were punished really through fines, imprisonment, or dismissal from the army. But starting at the end of 1776, authority to enforce discipline using coercion is strengthened. And these lash limits being raised to 100 and more capital crimes being included is a part of that program. Now here are 4 capital crimes. These are 4 crimes that could have led to you being executed. Take a moment to decide in what order you think they should be placed, depending on how often you think they occurred or they were adjudicated. And this will take a minute or two, but as you work through this, you'll see a little scrolling area for you to answer for each one, and just place them in the order. Okay, and we seem to have a fight for second between desertion to the enemy and theft. Theft's gone down to 4th. Desertion is remaining number 1. I feel like I'm watching a very slow horse race here. See who's going to win. All right. Desertion to the enemy is strongly becoming second now. All right. I think everybody did pretty well here. To start with, you're absolutely correct. Desertion would be the #1 crime. Theft actually was second, and then desertion to the enemy, and then mutiny. Now, let me go ahead and show you some numbers here that I think you might find interesting. All right, so the blue bar is the number of courts martial that were held for each of these capital crimes. And so you will see that by far desertion is the #1 capital crime that is tried throughout the war with over 800. And in fact, desertion will be the #1 crime period across all 3,265 courts martial that we know of right now that were held in the Army. Theft is #2, desertion of the enemy, and then mutiny. But the orange bar is the one that's interesting, because that is the number of those cases that resulted in a death penalty. And then next to it, the silver bar is the number of those cases which were pardoned. Fully a third of those capital crimes that resulted in a penalty of death were commuted. And something else to notice, look at how few soldiers were actually executed for desertion compared to the number of soldiers that were accused of it. And then take a look at desertion to the enemy. And you'll see that the relationship, the ratio is much different. But remember that desertion is one thing, but desertion when combined with treason is something completely different, right? So officers appear reluctant to enforce the law to its fullest extent for several reasons, including the fact that at times they agreed with their soldiers' grievances. If you really think about desertion and mutiny, those are reactions, those are forms of resistance, right? Soldiers are either deserting or mutinying because they believe they're not being treated fairly, not because they want to overturn the revolution, right? And in fact, in some cases, the officers agreed with their soldiers and were flummoxed about what to do. Take the case of General John Stark, who in 1778, while he's on the northern frontier, writes to Washington and says, my officers or my soldiers are threatening to mutiny, but they haven't been paid, they haven't been fed, and I can't clothe them. So how can I blame them? Right? Furthermore, soldiers would sometimes show their anger at what they viewed as officer overreach in regards to coercion. Take the example of a case of a cavalry soldier who was hanged for desertion in front of his regiment. But then after he died, the officer and the hangman attempted to take his boots from his dead body, something that they were allowed to do. The hangman was allowed to keep them. But the soldiers were so upset at what they saw that they began pelting the two with stones and drove them away from the body, insisting that this soldier be treated with respect. Now, one last little question here about discipline. Take a look at this. Desertion was a very serious problem for the Continental Army. Rate your agreement with that statement. Okay, it seems that for the most part, we agree, right? Almost strongly agree that desertion was a problem, a serious problem for the Continental Army. But let me show you this. Now, the blue bar are the number of men in each of the state lines, many of whom we've talked about tonight, that were enrolled on the muster for those state lines in Morristown during a very terrible winter of 79 and 80. And the orange bar are the number of those soldiers that are listed as having deserted. The silver bar are those who are gone, but they're gone because they're sick. In fact, desertion was not as big of a problem as we would think. The soldiers for the most part, stayed, despite the fact that they weren't being paid, despite the fact that they couldn't get enough food, despite the fact that they weren't being clothed. And while unit cohesion and attachment to their other fellow soldiers is certainly important, remember that if you desert, you're not just deserting your unit, you're deserting your buddies. I think it's also important that we recognize the strength of good leadership here by those officers in the face of starvation and exposure. All right, so it appears that coercion was not the way to go here during the Continental Army. If we think back, let's take a look at training. So if we think back to the events prior to Valley Forge, it's easy to see why Washington actually doesn't focus on training, and instead he focuses much more on discipline and coercion for a few years, right? He's surrounding Boston until March of 1776. He's fighting in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania through the winter of 1777. And so Valley Forge is his first opportunity to really focus on training. And the result of that focus, what is known as the Blue Book, or the Regulations for the Order and Discipline of Troops of the United States, established a standard for the manual of arms, for the evolutions, and for other actions taken by the Army on campaign. And what you're looking at here is a foldout from the book, from the regulations, that shows what a good encampment should look like. Now, the soldiers called this the Prussian drill, in honor of its author, the Baron von Steuben. And historians tend to focus on this part of the regulations. This is the majority of it. But I'm most fascinated by the last 14 pages, because the last 14 pages are the description of what good leadership looks like at every rank. Starting with the regimental commander, instructions are laid out for every position. Here you see a quote for the regimental commander, and I'll read it to you very quickly. It says, "There's no fatigue the soldiers go through that the officers should not share. And on all occasions, they should set them the example of patience and perseverance." Or take this one for the company commander, whose first object should be to gain the love of his men by treating them with kindness and humanity, inquiring into their complaints, and seeing them redressed. And it goes on. It goes for lieutenants. It goes for the first sergeant, for the non-commissioned officers, and it even tells the private soldier what he should do. In all cases, the autonomy and well-being of the private soldier is paramount. Even the non-commissioned officers are taught to instill discipline through mentorship, not through force. And along with this manual, Washington and his officers begin to demand that all the leaders in the Army lead by example, recognizing that their rank will not suffice. At one point, Washington tells his officers that they should carry their packs while on campaign, not put them on wagons. And Colonel Walter Stewart from Pennsylvania forces his company commanders to go to the hospital to see their sick soldiers, something these captains do not want to do because the soldiers are sick largely with smallpox. So what we're seeing here by 1778 is a new agreement that officers will have to gain their soldiers' willingness to follow. They cannot and will not be forced to do so. But what if this is not enough? All right, so now what you're looking at again is a blow up of some graphs that you've seen before, and these are the numbers of soldiers. And what you should notice is the huge drop off in numbers for almost every state line except for Connecticut in 1781. And why is that? That's because their 3-year enlistments are up. And now the soldiers get a chance to vote with their feet, with their willingness to re-enlist, and largely most of them want to go home. And in fact, by May of 1780, a mutiny has already started to brew after that terrible winter that we just talked about in the Connecticut line. And the Connecticut line, 2 regiments begin to mutiny, and it threatens to drag 4 Connecticut regiments and 4 Pennsylvania regiments into the mutiny against their officers. Now, the Connecticut regiment that starts it is the 8th. But while they say that they're talking about starvation and they're talking about lack of warmth and pay, of clothing and pay, really their problem is their lack of leadership in the regiment. In the 8th Connecticut, all three of their main field grade officers had been replaced over the last 3 years. And they were now being commanded by an officer, by a colonel who came from outside of the regiment, who didn't know them, and they didn't know. And when they were asked by Colonel Walter Stewart why they had mutinied, they said, because our officers don't care about us. And when Walter Stewart promised to take their grievances to their leadership, they all went back to their barracks. Because in fact, mutiny in the Continental Army, unlike in the Navy, is really a labor strike. Their causes are always a result of perceived failures of Congress to fulfill their contractual obligations in terms of pay, food, and clothing. But and they temporarily remove officer authority to show how upset they are. Now, this should have been a warning to the rest of the Army, because in January of 1781, both the Pennsylvania state line and then the New Jersey state line mutiny as well. These are much more famous mutinies that occur. And in fact, when it happens, Washington is forced to execute the leaders of the New Jersey line using New Jersey soldiers. And historians often look at these mutinies and try to figure out, okay, what happened? Well, they should have been asking what didn't happen. And what didn't happen was that the Massachusetts state line did not mutiny. In fact, the Massachusetts state line had the same problems. But unlike in Pennsylvania, in the Pennsylvania state line, where their assembly had failed to tell them that their pay was being rectified, it just hadn't happened yet, or in the New Jersey state line, where they were going from 3 regiments down to 1, and the non-commissioned officers were upset that they were losing their favorite commanders. In the Massachusetts line, General William Heath and Colonel Rufus Putnam, chief among the officers, went to the General Court of Massachusetts and said, we have a problem. And you need to come talk to these soldiers or they're not going to re-enlist. And in fact, the General Court came out, spoke to everyone, and then made the decision to rectify some of their arrears in pay, to give them more blankets, more food. And they passed a law to take care of their families that forced the towns to actually provide food for the women and children that were in the towns that had been left behind. So I would argue that in fact, these mutinies were not inevitable. They could have been avoided, or at least they may not have gotten as large as they did if only those other 2 state lines had been led in such a way as the soldiers believed that they were still being cared for. Okay, so I'm about to go over. So I just want to say in conclusion that in terms of leadership, everybody was changed by their experience over those 8 years of war for independence. Washington never received or was able to create the army that he set out to lead. His officers were never the gentleman officers he wanted, separated by a class consciousness that gave them a sense that they ought to lead by virtue of their rank. Nor did the colonial New England tradition prevail. Starting in 1777, soldiers lost their ability to choose their officers by virtue of enlistment, and they were forced to accept harsher punishments should they resist actions they would view as unfair or as violations of their enlistment contracts. But still, their autonomy as individuals with rights was recognized, and they insisted that this was so, and the officers agreed. And the result of that was a negotiated form of leadership that was uniquely American, that permeated most of the Army across all of the state lines, and I think laid the foundation for the way the U.S. Army is led today. So that concludes my my talk. I hope everybody enjoyed that. And Scott, I'll turn it back to you.
Sure. Well, happy to share the screen with you, Sean. I think we're together now, virtually together.
Okay.
That's fantastic. Yeah, so we'll probably take about 15 minutes or so and get to a couple questions. Thanks to those of you who threw some questions in. I'm going to use my prerogative as the person in front of the camera to actually ask the first one, just because of the slide that you ended on, of course, is Trumbull's painting showing Washington resigning his commission to Congress in December of 1783. And, you know, one of the most I think poignant moments in our Washington War Tent film here at the museum, you know, comes toward the end of the film, where we're reflecting on that moment of 1783, the end of the revolution, the end of the Revolutionary War. And we remind our viewers of an incredible letter that Washington writes to the New York Provincial Council in 1775. So as he's marching to take command at Boston, but has not arrived there yet, missing out on Bunker Hill, as you pointed out. But when the Provincial Council congratulates him on his appointment, but also there's this, and I'll paraphrase their language, but basically reminds Washington that once their liberties are restored, they're hoping that he will return back to his status as a civilian, echoing a little bit of concern from their reading of history, of course. And of course, Washington's great reply and that great line, "When we took up the soldier, we did not lay aside the citizen." And I'm just curious, of course, this is a subject very much in our minds as Americans right now, as we await the results of the election and what's going to happen in January, and that American tradition of the peaceful transfer of power. My question is actually, what element do you think the sort of what role did officers play in trying to educate and convey and reinforce the ideology of the American Revolution? Because obviously, if you were a British soldier, it was pretty clear where the lines of authority went, and when you were saluting something, what you were saluting, and where you fit into that great chain of being. But they're kind of making up something new here and trying to do it in the midst of this great invasion. So I'm just curious what role that played in this sort of evolution of military leadership.
Well, Scott, that was a great question. So it really depended on the officer. So for Washington, for example, Washington's general orders are replete with the rhetoric of the revolution, even as he says that he's going to shoot somebody for cowardice if they retreat. Right? During his general orders before the Battle of Long Island, he talks about how important it is that the soldiers stand up for liberty with a capital L, that they understand that they're defending not only their rights, but the rights of their countrymen, that, that they have to do everything they can to not fall into slavery under the tyranny of the British. And then in the same breath, he says, but if you do run away, you will be shot. And so, but Washington continues this rhetoric throughout, and those general orders were read. They had to be read daily. So if you were with him, you were getting a large dose of this. If you go even to a very junior level, you go to a captain. So Joseph Bloomfield, who becomes the staff judge advocate of the Army, right? When he's a captain, he's under Elias Dayton in the New Jersey line. And he is very much imbued with this belief in revolutionary rhetoric, and he is using it to lead his soldiers. He has this wonderful memoir of his time up in out west, and he talks about at one point he's in control not only of his own company but of another provincial state company that has come in, and he's trying to figure out how he's going to lead these guys. And he doesn't want to punish them. He threatens to lash men, but then he doesn't do it. He pulls back. He talks to them about what the revolution is all about. One of the soldiers dies, and the men all love him because he holds this funeral for this soldier as if this soldier was as important as an officer. He's doing all this stuff to show that they're equal in so many ways. And then you have officers that aren't as interested in being that way. But then you read soldiers' diaries, and they don't like those officers. It's very clear. Joseph Plum Martin's not a big fan of his company commander. So I mean, it varies.
Yeah, fabulous. Well, from the head, I guess let's go to the physicality. We have a great question from actually a new Revolution Society member, Mark Schutzman. Thanks, Mark, for being a Revolution Society member. And he asks, he observes, a lot has been made of Washington's physical stature and presence as a key quality of his leadership. This has been probably so commonly referred to from all his biographers that actually a recent biographer, Alexis Coe, has dubbed these historians who've written this the thigh men of dad history, and called into question, what's the significance of that kind of physicality? as an element in Washington's leadership. And I'm curious, what's your take on the Thigh Men?
Well, I think they may have, they probably focused on parts of the documents that I didn't. So while I was interested in what Washington had to say, obviously I had to be, right, and what it was that he wanted to do, I was much more interested in how junior officers were leading at the regimental level and how the soldiers viewed those officers, because those are the ones that they were in contact with most. Most of the time, when you read the soldiers' memoirs, I mean, they'll say they saw Washington. They'll talk about, maybe a time where they saw Washington walk by and they felt a sense of awe at the fact that he did so. But most of the time, I was really focusing on, what did Joseph Plum Martin think about as company commander, or what did Greenman think about being in the regiment, and when he had to stand out in the cold, stamping his feet, and he convinced one officer to give him some rum so he wouldn't keep the general awake, right? I mean, these were the things that I was focusing on. So I'll probably have to do some more study.
Yeah, no, I'm curious because, of course, Washington famously in his orders right before the march into Valley Forge, promises that he'll share in the hardships and partake of every inconvenience. And I'm just curious if you saw that sort of resonating in, of course, you read Martin, and one of the things that always strikes me about Joseph Paul Martin is how not present officers are in the sort of, most of his anecdotes and descriptions of service. I just was curious, does a when we go back to the word, if there was a word cloud of 1781, let's say, from the rank and file, would endurance, hardiness, sharing in those hardships, do you think that would have popped up?
Oh, absolutely. No, I know that would have popped up because you can see it when they complain. Most of the time when they complain because they slept out in the rain while their officers slept under a roof, or they believe that their officers are getting to eat when they're not getting a chance to eat. If you read one of the things that made Benedict Arnold so popular when he went through Maine to get to Quebec was that he did what they thought he should do, which was take the rations, divide them evenly, and then let everybody pick who was going to get what, right? And so yes, I mean, sometimes it's hard because you're looking for, something that maybe isn't there. They're not going to mention something they take for granted. But you definitely can tell, particularly in the negative, and soldiers like to complain. When I was a private in the airborne infantry, give me a steak, I'd probably complain about how it was cooked. So finding the complaints often was the easier way to go about it, and then finding the officers that could soothe those complaints or get the soldiers to do what they needed to do despite the harshness of their experience.
So we've had a couple of people, William Forrester. I saw someone else pop a question in related to was John Dabrowski. Both sort of asking about Washington's relationship with like the British military style. The question of was there something about British leadership that led to loss in the Revolutionary War, or to what was sort of Washington's? John asks, does Washington in any way try to lead differently from what the British did, knowing what he did about British ways, having served in the French and Indian War? To what degree is he influenced, to emulate versus to diverge from, I guess would be a question. And then do you see that as playing a role in the military outcome of the conflict?
Well, I think it plays a role. I'll answer the last part first. I think it plays a role in that Washington's development of how to lead these American soldiers means that the Army doesn't dissipate in the face of a defunct currency, a defunct supply system, or a non-existent supply system, really, for the most part, despite the hard work of many of those men, including Greene, to fix it. And despite any real support from the civilians that in the areas that they're at, because there's so much tension when they're there, they're taking food from people that live there and all that. So there's a lot of tension. I don't think that the British were bad leaders. I think the British leadership was leading the British Army the way British soldiers expected to be led based on the society that they came from. What I see in Washington is I see an evolution. If you look at Washington's demands in October of 1775, and then again in February of 1776, where he's like, I've got to have these things. I've got to be able to control my soldiers the way the British controlled them. And then you go to 1782, right? In 1783, where now, rather than demanding that he have more power, more authority to coerce them into staying in the army until the British sign the peace treaty and they leave, instead he's put them on a training regimen to keep them busy. He's going around and saying how great they are and how good they look. And yeah, I know you don't have hats, but besides that, you guys are looking fantastic. And oh, by the way, we're going to create an award. And those of you who have shown gallantry in the enlisted ranks, we're gonna let you act like you're officers, right? And for those of you who didn't get a chance to necessarily get that, we're going to recognize your loyalty and your service. Every 3 years you're in the Army. Notice every 3 years, right? You've enlisted more than once. Every 3 years, we're going to give you a service stripe. And that's going to come with, he's recognizing what they did. And so that's a very different Washington in my mind than the Washington who arrived in Boston in July of 1775. So
that's great. Yeah. Yeah. And actually, just to add to that, for William, the question about British leadership, what immediately springs to mind is Andrew O'Shaughnessy's The Men Who Lost America is really the book you want to read, which really explores sort of a similar take on the British military leadership, and it's just absolutely fabulous. So our good friend Chuck Downs observes that Washington really knew details about locations far outside of Virginia, and so he's curious about sort of what did officers know about the geography of different colonies. How were military operations shaped by? Was there kind of evolution over time in terms of mastery of surveying and geography?
Well, I think there were enough men who were serving in senior levels in the Continental Army who had served in the 7 Years' War. I think that's the first thing that's important to recognize, right? So this is why I think the Hudson River features so centrally to their strategic thoughts, because that's what they knew. That's where they had fought. They had fought up and down that river, that water corridor between Quebec and New York. And so they're very focused on it because that's what they know. If you think about, let's say, for example, Colonel Rufus Putnam, right? He's a private in the early part of the 7 Years' War, and then he's a sergeant. He almost gets to be a lieutenant, but then he kind of gets cheated out of that position, right? He's been up and down that area. That's why he gets to become the chief engineer, despite what he wants, at the very beginning of the war, of the Revolution. So there's a lot of knowledge of that area up in there. And then you have men like Benedict Arnold or some others who they're merchants. They maybe were captains on ships, right? One of the most storied regiments in the Army is Joseph Glover's Marbleheaders, right? And these people know trade, but they also know the coastline. They know the big cities. So yeah, there's a lot of knowledge there in that regard. Usually it's the French and the British who suffer from a lack of knowledge, particularly in the Chesapeake. Without the pilots, their navies have a very difficult time. So yeah, there's quite a bit of knowledge in that regard.
Yeah, and I'd point to, and I know you knew the Among His Troops exhibition very well. For those of you interested in the subject of geography and knowledge, if you go to the website, actually, amrevmuseum.org, scroll to the bottom, you'll see right there, very easily found, some of the museum's publications. That includes a catalog of our exhibition, Among His Troops, Washington's War Tent in a newly discovered watercolor. And that beautiful hardbound catalog of the exhibition includes a lot of exploration of the Department of the Geographer, the work that was done of surveying, map making, and it includes 2 full-size reproductions of the L'Enfant watercolors of West Point and Verplancks Point. I'm hoping I'll see a framed one of the West Point behind you the next time you're here speaking with us, Sean.
Absolutely.
There's a question from Stephen Kyer, who asks, were there any situations where an officer was executed for a crime in the
Okay,
country?
this is an excellent question.
Yeah.
So in fact, the answer in the Continental Army is no. Now, there was a British officer that was executed for espionage. That's John Andre, very famously, Major John Andre, who's executed for being a spy because when he met with Benedict Arnold to sell the plans to West Point in October of 1780, he's caught by some militiamen from New York, and he's not in his uniform, and therefore he's hanged as a spy. And Washington, of course, does want Benedict Arnold to return to him. He offers to trade John Andre back to the British for Benedict Arnold, and I believe Benedict Arnold would have been executed for what he did. But no, in all of the court martials that I've seen, officers were not subject to physical punishment. They were not. You could not whip an officer. You could not, you couldn't execute an officer unless it was a very high level of treason that had been perpetrated. Instead, you dismissed them. You often did so with infamy. And the reason for that was because an officer was supposed to have honor. That honor, the loss of it was supposed to be worse than death. And they would then publish in the local newspapers that this officer had been discharged with infamy, and that was going to then affect their social status for the rest of their lives. So no, they were not.
A follow-up question from Chuck Downs about von Steuben, which I think is really a great question, talking about how Washington was initially so focused on punishment, on enlistment terms, kind of locking men in, but notes that in the Blue Book, in that section that you highlighted, the relationships between the officers and the enlisted men seem to be more generous. And does that, do you think, reflect a change in Washington's sort of perspective? Is there influence from von Steuben that's showing here?
Yeah, I admit that I need to do a little bit more study to understand von Steuben better. But I will say that I think it absolutely shows that Washington is, at the very least, accepting that he needs to acknowledge the autonomy of the soldiers that are there, and that in order to keep them, he needs to do this. At the same time, the language is very 18th century. There's a lot of paternalism in the language, right? Soldiers should be loved by, or you should love their officers, right? Their officers should treat them with kindness and humility, almost as if they're fathers of these young men that are serving, right? There is some of that, but not to the extent that you would expect to see from, say, a Prussian officer. But of course, we know that von Steuben's past is a little clouded to some degree, right? I mean, I'm not positive of all of what he did before he joined the Continental Army. And like I said, I need to learn more there. But yes, I think that's Washington absolutely saying, hey, look, we need to recognize that these soldiers have to be led through training and through trust, much more so than they do through coercion.
So another question, and this comes from Stanley Weinstein, is interest in the different types of conflict. Of course, it's very striking. There's set piece, open field battles. There's irregular warfare, and he's interested in what the most important characteristic of a leader might, if it might vary depending upon the type of perhaps the type of unit, whether it's light infantry or regular infantry,
Sure.
and the sort of type of conflict that was taking place.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely possible. Again, as I define leadership, right, it's a negotiation of authority about how decisions are made and then how they're enacted. And those decisions change with missions, right, and with types of units, and with the types of cultures that they've come from, or perhaps the type of culture that you're creating because of what that unit does, right? So if if you're dealing with a group of soldiers who are dealing with low intensity conflict versus more conventional warfare, does that then change how you need to address them, how you need to make those decisions, what your relationship is with them? Sure, I think it does. But at the base, at the foundation of it, I think that that foundation is determined more by the society that created that army, the society that created those officers and those soldiers, and how they view one another in general as just people. That largely determines how those negotiations go.
Fantastic. Yeah. Well, maybe I'll throw a final question in here. I want to keep us at least close to our promised runtime here. So I'd love to bring it sort of back to the classroom and your work with the cadets and the young men and women who, soon after they leave you will be, leading other men and women in dangerous situations. And do you just have some reflections on how the cadets, sort of think about, feel connected to this tradition as you're teaching about the revolution? You have an incredible classroom, of course, that I think you had mentioned you can walk down to Revolutionary War fortifications, for a little classroom stroll and open air, COVID-free learning. So anything you'd just like to say about that sort of connection between past, present, and future would be
Yeah,
a great way
absolutely.
to end
Well,
this
I
evening.
mean, so the mission at the academy is, that we educate, train, and inspire leaders of character for service to the nation. And that mission statement is itself very much a product of the development of the American military and the American Army over the last almost 250 years. And so having a conversation with cadets about where all that started and how we think about where that started and what legacy that left moving forward into the conflicts of the 19th century and then into the 20th century is a real privilege for me. We at the Academy now have every plebe, every freshman, their first semester here, they take a course on the history of the American Army. And they start with the Continental Army and the American Revolution. We don't have time to go all the way back to the colonial tradition. We start with the American Revolution and the Continental Army. And they talk about leadership. They talk about what it means to be a good officer. They talk about what it means to be a good strategist and tactician and all of that. And it all starts there. And so it's a real privilege to study the kind of history that I study and then get the opportunity to talk to these amazing young men and women about the profession that they're entering into and the very important legacy that is given to them that starts in June of 1775.
Fantastic. Well, Lieutenant Colonel Shonigan P. Scully, we are grateful to you for your service on this, particularly on this Veterans Day week. This was just a wonderful talk. Our first interactive Read the Revolution lecture, by the way. I absolutely loved it. This is a tool that we are definitely going to look into using for our virtual field trips, for instance. I can already see our educators getting really excited about
Well, I
using
hope
it.
everybody else enjoys it. It's a lot of
Absolutely.
fun. It also works in live lectures. I've used it with cadets where I had 1,200 of them in an auditorium. It actually works pretty well too.
Oh, fantastic. Well, all of you who are with us tonight, you're going to get, you'll have a little survey monkey that will pop up to give us some feedback on the program tonight. Please give us that feedback. That's how we get better. Check out upcoming events, future Read the Revolution programs. We will send you all a recording of this evening's program that you can share widely. So that'll be coming down the line. Please enjoy Veterans Day weekend. Be safe out there. And we look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Thanks, Sean.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Hannah. Thanks, everybody at the museum.